This is the first of 3 videos that I'm going to present that will tell the story of how God supernaturally came into my life and into the life of my family. It is an interesting story of how God can really change a person and how God acts today, and yes, in a supernatural way, by the agency of the Holy Spirit. Just before I start this series, I want to say this. Some of what I am going to say in these 3 videos you may find difficult to believe. I understand that. I understand that some of the things that I say may confront your view of the world and what it is like, and indeed what you believe. But I assure you that everything that I am saying in these videos is absolutely true. There is no embellishment, there is no lies in any of what I am saying. This happened as I am saying it in these videos. My name is John Jeffries. I'm the pastor of the Croydon Pentecostal Church. Our church does not have a physical location, but our members are currently all live in Melbourne, Australia. Our ministry is through the website www.jesusreasons.com and also through supplying financial support to Christian organisations. In this first video, I'm going to give you the background of my family's situation. In this first video, there will be very little said about God and about what God has done in our family. The reason for this is that I wanted you to understand the background of where my family came from, and so that what is said in the next 2 videos will be all that more amazing. In the second video, I will tell you the story of my father and how God supernaturally came into his life. It is an extraordinary story of how God gave him a dream and also did other things in his life by the agency of the Spirit of God without him even owning a Bible and knowing very little about what Christianity or Jesus was about. And finally, in the third video, I'll talk about myself, how I came to be a Christian and the way that God also supernaturally entered into my life. And I want to be also clear about another thing, is that all of the things that happened to me and my family and my father and so on are found in the Bible. These events cannot be explained rationally without understanding things that happened to people in the first century that are recorded in the Bible. And that is why this is a testimony of Jesus Christ, of how Jesus came into our family and me and into my life and changed us forever. I invite you to join me as we listen to a remarkable and deeply personal story of how God entered the life of the Jeffries family. I'm going to start this story on the 25th of April 1915. Yes, over 100 years ago. That date, the 25th of April 1915, is one of the most significant dates in the history of the Australian people and perhaps the New Zealand people as well, because it was on that day that the Australian and New Zealand forces, known as the Anzacs, invaded Gallipoli along with the British Army. And the campaign at Gallipoli was eventually a failure, and there were very heavy losses of the Australian troops, but it is a day that lives in the memory of Australians because some people say that maybe we were born as a nation on that day. Now, I mention it because my great-grandfather, John Middleton Jeffreys, was at Gallipoli. He was in the 5th Battalion and came in on the second wave of troops. As I said, the Australian and New Zealand forces met very heavily resistance from the Turkish army. The Australian forces were on the beaches while the Turkish forces were above them with machine guns, and such was the nature of war in those days that soldiers were asked to charge down machine guns. My great-grandfather was not one of those who was killed, however he was terribly wounded. And from the medical records in the archives of the Australian Army, I see that he was shot in the head and the side on the 26th of April 1915, and that was the end of his war. My great-grandfather enlisted in the army when he was relatively old for a soldier in those days. He was 38 years old. His first wife had previously died in 1912, and at the age of 38 he would have been considered a middle-aged man in those days. Yet he enlisted, as so many did, and he went off to fight at Gallipoli. My great-grandfather nearly died. He was taken on a hospital ship to Cyprus and then to Alexandria in Egypt, where he eventually recovered. However, unfortunately, he had part of his brain removed due to the gunshot wound in his head. Eventually, he was transported back to Australia during 1915 and was then no longer part of the army or the armed forces. Unfortunately, the trauma of what he had seen caused post-traumatic stress disorder. I know this from the medical records. The unfortunate thing about this was that when he drank alcohol, it made things very bad for those people who were around him. He became very violent, and eventually, in 1927, he was committed to the Heidelberg Repatriation Hospital in their area that deals with mental illness, and he remained there until he died in 1948. As a side note, in the 1960s, the Australian government issued Gallipoli medals to the families and to those soldiers who still survived who were at Gallipoli. My grandfather applied for that medal and gave it to me on my 21st birthday. Going back to the post-First World War period, my great-grandfather did remarry to a lady called May, who by all accounts was quite a kind person. They brought up my grandfather, who was born in January 1909. Also, May and my great-grandfather took in 2 other boys who were not related to them, and my grandfather and those 2 boys basically grew up as brothers. However, my grandfather grew up in an environment where his father, having been affected by the war and by alcohol, became violent. It was also the 1920s when people weren't particularly rich or wealthy, and this particular family, the Jeffreys family, weren't in the wealthy category by any means. Somewhere around, I would say, 1926 or early 1927, my grandfather, and his name was Lewis Jeffries, met a young girl called Annie Pearl Mackin. She later became known as Nance or Nancy. And they were still teenagers at the time, and they conceived a son, my father, out of wedlock. And my father, also known as Lewis Jeffries, was born on the 26th of December 1927. My grandparents, Lewis and his wife Nancy, married in September 1927. My family never spoke about this period in their lives, and I suspect that the commitment of my great-grandfather, John Middleton Jeffries, into the Heidelberg Repatriation Hospital at about the same time as my grandmother was pregnant and gave birth to my father, I suspect those incidents weren't unrelated. However, I can only speculate. As you will be aware, in the late 1920s, things were very tough. The Great Depression occurred in 1929, and for the very young family, my grandfather, his wife, Nancy, and my father, also Lewis, who was at that time only a few years old, it was pretty tough. My grandfather couldn't get work. My grandmother could get some work, but it was really hand to mouth. And on top of that, what happened in about 1930 was that there was an epidemic of poliomyelitis, and children were particularly susceptible to this, and my father contracted polio when he was only 3 years old. This had a profound effect on the rest of his life. So we had the situation where the family was extremely poor and also had a small baby that was in need of great amounts of medical attention. The polio affected my father profoundly. It twisted his spine, and he should have been about 6 foot tall, quite a big man for those days, but instead, because of his twisted spine, he was only 5'2", and you could see a lump protruding on the right side of his back all of his life. Indeed, when he was quite young, a very eminent doctor said that my father would die before he was 21 years old, due to the fact that the structure of his body, his skeletal structure, wouldn't be sufficiently large to be able to contain the organs in his body, and he would therefore die by the time he was 21. This also had some impact on my father, as you would imagine. Something I want to make clear at this stage is that all of the people that I've spoken about so far had no connection with Christian churches at all. As far as I could tell, they probably didn't own Bibles, they definitely didn't go to churches, and were frankly pretty skeptical about Christianity and churches. During the 1930s, it was still tough, but eventually my grandfather found work in an iron foundry where he worked at for about 7 years. And it was tough work because what he did was break iron for 7 years. And so this at least gave him some steady employment. And in 1938, he borrowed £60 from a solicitor in Melbourne and purchased a holiday shack out in the bush where in the what is now the suburb of Montrose. And this was quite an event for the young family in those days, because they were escaping what were then the slums of Collingwood and Fitzroy and so forth, and were able to get out, in, if you like, into the fresh air of the outer eastern regions of Melbourne. Indeed, it was considered to be well into the country in those days. And I think that my grandfather must have travelled by train to that iron foundry each day. By this time, my father was about 10 or 11. His start at school was delayed until he was about 7 years old. And he originally went to school in Collingwood, Gold Street in Collingwood. He then went to the school at Montrose. So at this stage, things were looking a little up for the family. They had bought a house, they had a regular job, and at least life was somewhat stable. But as you know, then the Second World War came. My grandfather would never speak of the Second World War. Whenever I asked him about it, he would shake his head and just walk away. His military records show that he joined the Australian Army in 1942. This may have been a little late in the piece for the Second World War, but I suspect that what happened was that when there was a real prospect of an invasion by the Japanese into Australia, that motivated him to sign up. He had seen what war had done to his father, and he joined the Australian military in the medical corps. I suspect again that he did not want to be in a combat unit, but at any rate, that was where he signed up. My grandfather travelled to New South Wales for training, and he was then supposed to board the ship Centaur, which was a hospital ship that was going into the war regions, presumably up around New Guinea and so forth. However, my grandfather never made it onto that ship because he was ill, and because of his illness, he wasn't medically fit to board the ship. The Centaur was sunk by the Japanese by a Japanese submarine on the 14th of May 1943 off the coast of Brisbane. This is one of the terrible events of the Second World War because this ship was unarmed and it was a clearly marked hospital ship. And 286 people on that ship died, including people from the medical area, as you would expect, and almost certainly my grandfather knew many of the people that died. Having looked at my grandfather's medical records, I strongly suspect that this event caused him great anxiety and difficulty. He should have been on that ship and probably he would have died. But he did not, and he continued to be in the army, but also he had considerable illness while still in the army. There was attacks of anxiety, he had a hernia problem, and other issues that show in his medical records, which are extensive from the point of view of the illnesses that he suffered. Eventually, the army discharged him as medically unfit in 1944. The reason that I know about the Centaur, because my grandfather never spoke of it, was that my grandmother, Nancy Jeffries, said that to me when I was quite a young boy. I can remember that conversation just with her and me, and saying that he should have been on a ship that was torpedoed by the Japanese. After the war, my grandparents and my father continued living in the bush location of Montrose. They tried their hand at a business, which was the fruit store in Montrose. And I remember that store because it was still there when I was a boy in the 1960s. I'm not sure when that business venture finished, But what happened was that my grandfather, Lewis Jeffries, eventually got a job with a firm called Nilex. He originally began in Richmond and later went to the Lilydale site, where he dug the first post hole for the very first post for the building of that factory. Now, it also transpired that my father, also Lewis Jeffries, obtained employment with Nilex, and he soon went to the Lilydale factory of Nilex. Nilex in those days was a manufacturer of cables, and so that factory, it still exists, not under the Nilex name, but it still exists just near the Lilydale railway station. My father started his employment with Nilex in 1951, and he worked with them for 17 years. My grandfather worked with Nilex for 22 years until his retirement when he reached the age of 60. Now I'll just say a few things about my mother. She was born in September 1935 in Trentham, which is a country town in Victoria, not far from Woodend. Her maiden name was Hunt, and she was one of 10 siblings. A couple of her brothers did go and serve in the Second World War, but my mother was far too young to be involved. In the first half of the 1950s, she moved from Trentham to Melbourne to train as a nurse, which she spent 3 years doing. She trained at the Royal Melbourne Hospital and also spent some time at the Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital. This hospital no longer exists, but she was there. Importantly, the Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital, as it was known, dealt with patients who had contracted poliomyelitis, and she was a young trainee nurse on the ward when a man named John Hamp was there with polio. He had emigrated from England, and he had a form of polio known as bulbar polio. Bulbar polio is something that affects the respiratory system, and in those days it was a virtual death sentence. Now, what happened is that on one night there was John Hamp and 7 others also with bulbar polio, and my mother was on the ward that night, and 7 of those 8 people died that night, and John Hamp did not. And so my mother was there to witness that and to also have the first contact that she'd ever had with John Hamp. And I will mention John Hamp again, and just to make it clear at this point that my father at this point had not met John Hamp. John Hamp becomes a significant figure in the story of our family. Here is a photo that was taken of John Hamp and my father in 1980. It's the earliest photo that I have of John Hamp. John Hamp is on the left and my father is on the right of the photo. Fortunately for John Hamp, at about that time, the vaccine for polio was discovered, and this was administered to him, and this enabled the saving of his life. The polio did have severe effects on him, and for many years after, he had to be very careful with the way he swallowed food and so forth, lest he choke. But nevertheless, he did survive and went on to live for many years thereafter. Now, it is important to understand that after John had been released from hospital, or sometime after, he also obtained a job at Nilex in Lilydale, where my father was working and also my grandfather. And John was employed as a draftsman for various activities within the factory. Now I'll turn to how my father and mother met, because that's also important in the story. So, in the 50s, my father was advised that there had been some technical advancements in medical technology that might help him with the way his body had been deformed by the polio. My father was in great pain, although only a young man, and he was so in pain that he could not bend down to do up his shoelaces. So the doctors offered him quite a dramatic situation whereby he would be put in hospital for a 2-year period in a plaster cast, and that his body would be put in traction for those 2 years, and that they thought that that might help his situation. And because my father could see no other alternative, he decided to undergo that treatment and went into hospital. As it turned out, he was only in hospital for 8 months. He was in a plaster cast, and there were forceps that were placed into his head, and he was put in traction for that period of time. So not a great way to spend your time. However, one day a young nurse came onto the ward carrying a bedpan, and that was Muriel Hunt, who became my mother. And thus my father and my mother met at that hospital, and they started going out, and eventually they were married in September 1956. My mother was only 4 foot 11 inches, and so my father, being 5 foot 2 inches, was actually taller than her. When they were married, my father was still working at Nilex, and my grandparents gifted some land to my father and mother, on which my father built his house. It was quite a common thing in those days and in that area for people to buy land and then actually build their own house. So my father bought a book on carpentry and did that. Then, after 2 miscarriages, my mother gave birth to my older brother James, and he was born on the 27th of September 1958. So that's the background to our family before God supernaturally entered into the life of our family. I wanted to just set out it in this way so that you understood how little involvement our family had had with God, with churches, with the Bible. My mother was brought up as an Anglican, and when she was married, my father used to take her to the Anglican church in Montrose, but he would not go in. So that happened every Sunday. So my mother did have faith in God and knew the Bible, but my father did not. But in the next video, I will explain how God came into the life of our family through a supernatural occurrence, or actually more than one, in the life of my father, and thus began a new era for our family. I'll see you in the next video.